This is the constitutional era objective 3 about how the Washington administration established the American economy and presidential tradition. And when you look at this whole thing, you'd think at this point we'd be happy finally. We had our Constitution, but remember, the political culture from 1776 to 1789 had not been good. In those 13 years, we had declared independence against our king. We had overthrown that king in a revolution, or at least got him out of our country. And then when we set up our own government, the Articles of Confederation decided we didn't like that and threw that out as well. So it had been kind of a rocky road. Also, we had a government with no revenue. Remember, under the Articles of Confederation, the U.S. government didn't tax, so we had no revenue, just a lot of debts left over from the war. We had to pay a lot of people off for the things that we had done in the war. We'd bought a lot of stuff. And we had no real national security yet. If Pennsylvania got attacked by the British, New York could just look and say, wow, that really sucks for them. So some stability in government was needed very quickly. That being said, George Washington gets unanimously elected our first president in 1789. It's the only time in American history that the Electoral College had a unanimous vote. But why George Washington? Well, at one time, Washington had been Supreme Commander of the Revolutionary Army, if you remember, or at least know that, when we declared independence against Great Britain and revolted against them. And Washington had been selected chairman of the Constitutional Convention. Washington was a tall, calm man of great character. People rarely, if ever, questioned his integrity, especially since he was so willing to take outside opinions before he made any decisions. To a lot of people, because of his background and just his character and nature in and of itself, he was the perfect choice for President of the United States. And there was a very elaborate ceremony when he took the oath of office in New York, which was the national capital at the time, overlooking Wall Street from a balcony, the only American president who was not inaugurated in Washington, D.C. Now, that was one unique thing about the Washington presidency, but when you stop and think about it, everything about the Washington presidency was unique because nobody had ever done this before. George Washington pioneered how and what the American president was supposed to be. And it's through the traditions that he created that we have the American president that we have now, at least the office, not necessarily the person. What a president is supposed to do, what a president is supposed to say, how they are supposed to act, and how they're supposed to carry themselves, even in the modern day, is based on what George Washington did first to establish those traditions. Now, we haven't held on to all the traditions. For example, George Washington, when he was president, would not shake hands with anybody. It totally went against his character, because when he was a commander of troops in the American Revolution, he'd get off his horse and walk with the soldiers. He was a common man, essentially, although he had a lot of money. But when he was president, he just didn't feel like that was something that the American president would do. Now, George Washington himself as a person was not averse to that, but he didn't think that was something that the president should do. Now, again, it's not Washington being arrogant, but it's this idea that the man or the woman who takes the office of the American presidency has to think of themselves as the American president and not necessarily think of themselves as who they are personally. That was the tradition that was established by George Washington. And again, the handshaking tradition, we did away with that one. But there were some others that we held on to that were really good. For example, one tradition that we have is that presidents are inaugurated and live in Washington, D.C., also known as Washington District of Columbia, named after George Washington and Christopher Columbus. Now, Washington's role in this presidential tradition was pretty hands-on. He was asked to go down to the state of Maryland and survey a plot of land that was intended to be the location of the next federal capital. That plot of land was marshy and swampy and called Foggy Bottom, not a very auspicious name for what would become later Washington, D.C., and frankly, there's rumor that Washington, D.C. is sinking a little bit every year. I don't know if that's true or not. But what makes this all the more ironic is that despite the fact that Washington did the surveying for the territory that would become the town named after him, he is still the only president to not live in Washington, D.C. It ended up being built after his death. The capital during his presidency was New York City, where he was inaugurated and where he lived. Now, that's only one presidential tradition. One other tradition that George Washington started was the concept of the cabinet. If you don't know what the cabinet is, think of the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense and the departments they're in charge of, the State Department, the Defense Department, et cetera, et cetera. Currently, we, over the years, have added 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 presidential advisors to the cabinet, but there's nothing in the Constitution that really calls for a presidential cabinet. The only thing the Constitution says is that the president may seek the advice or counsel of others. Well, George Washington took that to the next level and created the original and likely the best ever cabinet of presidential advisors. And originally it was only 3 guys. The first was Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State who would be in charge of the new State Department. Now, the State Department deals with foreign nations, and the Secretary of State takes the lead on that. And because of that, this is often seen as a stepping stone to the presidency. When you're running for president, the one advantage you have if you've been Secretary of State is that you've already dealt with foreign nations, whereas your opponents running for president probably have not. And that served Thomas Jefferson well as he eventually became the 3rd president of the United States. In fact, if you look at American history, many presidents had been secretaries of state at one time or another, and that gave them a leg up in their elections. Again, they had foreign policy experience that others didn't necessarily have. Now, the State Department is considered to be by far the most prestigious cabinet position, or Secretary of State, I should say, because it was the first one that was created, it was the oldest, and it had a lot of the responsibilities that a president would also have. The next one was the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. You see him nowadays on your $10 bill. He was charged with getting the American economy up and running. And Washington's first Secretary of War, a title that is now known as Secretary of Defense, was Henry Knox, the guy who was in charge of the cannons during the American Revolution. And Fort Knox in Kentucky is named after Henry Knox. Okay, that's it for the basic aspects of some of the traditions in the Washington administration. We'll be touching on some more traditions that George Washington started and mentioning those in future lessons. Thanks for listening.